So Unit 3 is titled The Role of the Colonial State in Development Process. Now, in the name itself, the unit talks about the colonial administration and its role in influencing development in the territories back then, territories of Papua New Guinea before 1973 and eventually 1975. So 1973 is when Papua and New Guinea got its self-government, and after that 2 years and Papua New Guinea got its independence. Again here, if you look at the study guide, always start by looking at the objectives. So last week we've done that. We look at the objectives and try and answer the, you can say, questions that arise from the objectives here. So if you can look at your study guide, the objectives here, there are 4 objectives. Number 1 objectives, your responsibility, rather duty, is to simplify, break down what colonial state is and its nature. So you have to, in other words, simplify, try to explain simply the colonial state and the nature of colonial state, how colonial state behaves. Now secondly, elaborate or discuss further how and why colonial state is involved in development process. So basically the second objective is for you to ask back the question, how and why the importance, significance of the colonial state in its effort to initiate development in the colonial territories. Thirdly, write down a few paragraphs how and why indigenous people. You can leave out the third objective here. All right, the third objective is an activity rather than an objective. And finally, discuss the concept of development. So basically, the unit 3, the role of colonial state, the cause, not cause and effect, but we are trying to understand the colonial state's involvement in the development of the territories. Now, if you break down the development theme or development idea, development in terms of social development, economic development, and political development. So the role of colonial state in influencing these 3 parts of development: economic, social, and political development in Papua and New Guinea territories, or rather after 1949, after the Papua New Guinea Act, Papua and New Guinea territories before independence. So let's look at what is captured in the unit discussion here. And I'll read the introduction, the first sentence. In this unit, the colonial state is examined within the period leading up to 1975. All right, so the content discussion is talking about events leading up to 1975, but it doesn't specify what sort of timeline. So our guess would be events starting from 1884 to 1975. So within this brief period here, this is where there is presence of colonial state. After 1975, then that is another era of what is called the post-colonial state. And I'll read the second sentence. The colonial state was really the Australian Commonwealth state exercising power, authority, and influence in Papua under various Australian government. All right, here it extends further by saying that what is a colonial state? The colonial state exemplified here is, or talking about the Australian government or the Australian colonial administration. So Australian colonial administration have had an impact on Papua and New Guinea territories starting in 1906. All right, 1906 when the British left, they gave the Papua territory to Australia, and then after World War I rather, 1918, then Australian government took on the mantle of taking care of Papua New Guinea territories. So basically, the colonial state is referring to the Australian colonial administration in Papua New Guinea. Okay, let me see. I'll try and summarize the introduction and see how that sort of fits with our objectives here. All right, so basically, in the introduction section, the colonial state introduced various important features in Papua New Guinea in terms of development. So the Australian colonial administration introduced the Westminster system that we have, all right, the representative democracy. For example, in 1949, when the Papua New Guinea Act came together, in 1951, the first legislative council was formed. 1964, the first House of Assembly, 1968 and 72. So we have 3 House of Assembly elections, in which the establishment of the Legislative Council and the House of Assembly in itself gives or establishes this Westminster system that we have. So that is, in terms of political development, the colonial administration helped to shape the Westminster system that we have and we have been using after independence. Secondly, the colonial administration introduced to us the idea of working for money. Since the establishment of plantation system, it was basically the colonial administration trying to influence the development in terms of economy. So they tried to set up plantation after 1945, introduced the islands labor scheme in 1951, the discovery of the islands region in the 1940s, and we've seen the establishment of coffee plantation in the islands region. That is an example of how, or the importance of the role of the colonial state in economic development. All right? Social development. The colonial state has introduced the education system, and we are communicating in the English language as a result of the colonial legacy. You are wearing your shoes, shirt, clothes, depends on whatever brand that is. You're not sitting down here with headdress, gaskets and tangets. You're wearing modern clothes. You're walking around, talking, using your phone, going on Facebook, posting videos, creating content. This is an example of the legacy left behind by the colonial administration or the colonial state. So, the example here, or the modern crop of Papua New Guineans, including myself talking to you and you sitting there and listening to this lecture here, that is an example of the social development aspect that was influenced by the colonial administration. All right, so the introduction tries to give us this idea of political, economical, social development that was brought forward by the colonial administration. Okay, if you look further down, so look at the subheading of Papua New Guinea's achievement of self-government in 1973, and the other subheading is the production of cash crops for income and the idea for development. So basically this unit here talks about 3 things. Colonial administration brought in the type of political system that we have called the Westminster system. Secondly, PNG's achievement of self-government was influenced by the colonial administration and its idea of representative democracy. And then production of cash crops for income. So I tend to, in the introduction, tend to repeat those important ideas, but let me go through this first subheading here, the introduction of the Westminster parliamentary system, and I'll read the first sentence. So the Westminster parliamentary system is a form of government where there are three arms: the executive, legislative, and judiciary. The executive is responsible for implementing the official decisions of the government and the laws. Legislature are responsible for lawmaking powers, while the judiciary interprets these laws. So basically, in 1951, the first legislative council was formed. The first legislative council have established the three arms of government: the executive, the legislature, and what is the other one? The executive, legislature, judiciary. Yes. So, what the unit tried to say is that colonial administration introduced that Westminster system. And when that Westminster system was introduced, it created these three separate arms of government. And those three separate arms of government are supposed to act and behave independently of each other. And that's all the birth of the Westminster style of government that we have as a result of the colonial administration. Now, secondly, the second heading here, PNG's achievement of self-government in 1972. I'll try and read the first sentence to get an idea of what this section is talking about. PNG gained self-government from Australia in 1973. This meant that it had a chief minister. He was the late Grand Chief Sir Michael Somare. As he was then known, Somare and his cabinet were responsible for all matters except defense and foreign affairs. Okay, so it gives a brief idea of self-government. So after the establishment, colonial administration established the Westminster system. The colonial administration had set up pathways for Papua New Guinea to become independent. What were these pathways? After the 1951 Legislative Council, the colonial administration in 1964 set up the first House of Assembly. It is the first House of Assembly that we've seen our founding fathers and other founding fathers as well, including Somare and his team, indigenous leaders, came onto the political front or the political scene. Now this is important. The first House of Assembly created the idea of elections. We have our founding fathers become leaders during this time in 1968 and 72. So the House of Assembly itself prepared our, let's say, our leaders, our founding fathers, and the state to become self-government in 1973. So that is an important, let's say, idea in terms of how, or the importance of colonial administration in establishing, number one, a political system, and number two, preparing Papua New Guinea for self-government. All right? So self-government and the Westminster system that we have will not come about if it had not been for the colonial administration. So that unit is trying to paint that picture. Now let's look at the third subheading, which is production of crops for income. And I'll read first, and just to try to get an idea of what is happening here. All right, so Papua New Guineans not only produce copra, cocoa or coffee in expatriate-owned plantations for an income, they also produce these crops for income in their own plantation. Many people produce copra, coffee or cocoa and sell them to cooperative societies or to private buyers for an income. All right, so this first sentence or first two sentences here. The colonial administration set up various plantations and encouraged various planters okay, white settlers. Example, coffee was, not coffee, sorry, rather. The islands region was introduced or established, or islands region was discovered, that's the right word, discovered in the 1940s. And what the colonial administration had found out was the islands region holds some of the fertile soil and land in the region. And that sort of attracted white settlers, planters, especially to the islands region. So they went there, okay, establishing in Goroka, Simbu, Western Islands, Southern Islands. So these white men, or the white settlers, established plantation, and they started to recruit locals, indigenous, to work on those plantations. So when those locals or indigenous people, our people, working on those plantations, they started to learn important skills about plantation. And then they started to embrace the value of money. So when that happened, it also encouraged those indigenous people working alongside with the white planters or plantation, and they started to grow coffee and sell coffee, export coffee as well. And now we know there are a lot of indigenous, or not indigenous during that time, but Papua New Guineans growing coffee in the island region. Yes, all right. So that is a byproduct of the colonial legacy. And it wouldn't come about if it weren't for the colonial administration encouraging cash crops or plantation system in Papua New Guinea. And in addition to that, and it's not mentioned here, we are all seated here. We are part of a religion, or rather religion, Christian domination. So you are part of a church. You have the SDAs, Catholics, and other religion or other Christian churches. Why is this important? Church and the idea of Christianity was never part of Papua New Guinean culture, the indigenous culture. I have my own God that I believe prior to the colonization, so as the other parts of the region. Our spirit ancestors, we derive our rituals and our spirit, let's say our religion, from the head or our environment. Now, if it wasn't for the colonial administration under the Governor Hubert Murray, I believe, and his strategy, they call it the peaceful penetration, have encouraged missionaries to go around Papua New Guinea to spread the gospel. And because of the encouragement by the colonial administration, you and myself here, we are now belonging to a certain Christian church. So so the idea in this unit is the importance of the colonial administration on these various parts of development in our country, socio-economical and political development. I'll read the last section here. It's titled Development. So development is the process of improvement in the material standard of living, education, health, employment, income, and biodiversity, and in the production and output capacity of the economy over a long period of time. So this is a very, very long sentence, but the key idea is that the development in terms of material standard. Now, what does that mean? Development in material standard, individual level. If you are still wearing tangets or graskets, putting on face paint, wearing a dress and coming and sitting here, you may be categorized as primitive, rightfully so. This is the first stage of any development. You have to start from the primitive stage. Okay, don't get me wrong, primitive does the primitive word itself tends to derive negativity. But from an educational academic point of view, primitive is the starting point of development. You cannot develop without starting from the infant stage. All right? So, development in material standard. You are wearing clothes right now and sitting here. That means we have achieved some form of development in material standard. Okay, the clothes you are wearing is made up of certain form of material. Okay, if you're coming in with a gasket here, that means you are at a stage 1 of development. So something like that. So when our society was scattered around and not having to be in a structure or institutional structure, that means we were living in a primitive society. Only when the colonial administration came in, they introduced the Westminster system. So now we've moved from the primitive political state into a modern political state, and that is accepting the Westminster system and accepting the idea of representative democracy. All right? So development in that sense is that the colonial administration has enabled us as a people to move past the primitive state. So if you're holding machete, if you're holding machete or long bush knives and walking around and trying to cut people, okay, that existed in the primitive time. That is why they can call you primitive, because you haven't surpassed the development stage. Sometimes Papua New Guineans we tend to go back to the primitive stage. But anyway, that's another discussion for another time. But the important idea here that the unit want to put forward is that the colonial administration has introduced us to a modern political system, the modern economical system, and the modern social system. All right. So that concludes unit